All right, I'll go ahead and just welcome everyone. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our PolitiFest session this morning on Saturday. My name is Erica Connell. I'm the Director of Philanthropy for the Voice of San Diego. Just have a quick couple of housekeeping items before we get the panel going. As you may know, Voice of San Diego is a nonprofit investigative news organization. We're committed to holding public officials accountable and giving you, the public, the tools that you need to be advocates for the public good. As a nonprofit, we rely on the support of members and donors like you, so thank you for your support. I'd like to recognize a couple of sponsors who've made this possible, including the Google News Initiative, the College of Arts and Sciences at USD for giving tickets away to students, the San Diego Foundation for supporting community conversations, as well as Cox Communications, SDG&E, the Atlantis Group, the City of San Diego Retired Employees Association, City Heights Community Development Corporation, the San Diego County Democratic Party, and Business for Good. I know that we've had a lot of sessions this week. You will be able to see them on the event website at CVent. You can also get your own VOSD mug and drinking glass if you're so interested. I'll put a link to that as well. For this session, please put your questions in the Q&A section down there at the bottom so that the panelists can have the opportunity to answer them for you. You can also tweet along with the session if you like and use the hashtag PolitiFest2020. All right, I will turn it over now to you, Chelsea, so you can start off the session.
Awesome, thank you, Erica. So thank you all for joining us for this community conversation on policies to reduce the role, presence, and budget of local police. My name is Chelsea Birkesdotter. I serve as the Policy Associate at the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial Counties, where I work on policing and privacy issues. Today, I have the pleasure to serve as a moderator of this fabulous panel. The murder of George Floyd sparked a national conversation about police violence, including here locally. This conversation is not new to San Diego. It's one that has continuously resurfaced with the killings and deaths of Alfred Olango, Earl McNeil, Jonathan Cornell, Aleah Jenkins, and many others. What has shifted, though, is the conversation around how to address police violence. More and more communities are calling for the divestment from policing and the investment in non-law enforcement alternatives. This community conversation will discuss policy solutions that local governments can enact to respond to these calls for bold political action. Today, we are joined by an amazing set of panelists. First, we have Bishop Bowser, Director of Shabbat Outreach. Cornelius Bowser was born and raised in San Diego. His expertise on gangs comes from being a member of the West Coast Crips. In 1987, he accepted the call to ministry, and since then, Bishop Bowser's work in the community has been prolific. He has served as a commissioner to the City of San Diego Commission on Gang Prevention and Intervention. He is a founding member of CAST, which stands for Community Assistance Support Team, which helps reduce gang violence in the city. Next, we have Dr. Kira Green, Executive Director of the Center on Policy Initiatives. Before joining CPI, Dr. Green was an assistant professor of sociology at San Diego State University, where she taught courses on socioeconomic inequality, race, and qualitative research methods. Dr. Green earned her MA and PhD in sociology from Stanford University. Next, we have Tasha Williamson. Tasha is a dynamic woman, a celebrated activist, co-founder of Hotel Vouchers for All, as well as the San Diego Compassion Project, supporter of CAST, and a justice fighter for people harmed by systemic justice. Despite receiving death threats for her work, she remains unwavering alongside the community's fight for justice, equality, freedom, and equity. Last but not least, we have Michele Woodson. Michele is the Executive Director of Think Dignity, an organization dedicated to advancing basic dignity for those living on the streets. Michele is a founding member of Free SD, which utilizes the approach of participatory defense, and the Dee Dee McClure Community Bail Fund, a grassroots organization committed to fighting against the devastating effects of cash bail system and supporting those who have been victimized by it. Vichelli received her Juris Doctor from Thomas Jefferson School of Law and a Bachelor of Science in Political Science from the University of California, San Diego. All the panelists before you, including myself, are members of a coalition for police accountability and transparency, also known as CPAT, CPAT. So let's jump right into the conversation. Let's start with looking at the current role of police and what policing looks like in San Diego. According to analysis by Campaign Bureau and the New York Times, from 2018 to 2019, fewer than 15% of police stops by SDPD and the sheriff were initiated from 911 calls. In other words, most police stops are officer initiated. And only 1% of 911 calls so far this year in San Diego have been for violent crimes. So Tasha and Bishop Bowser, both of you have years of experience working in communities that are over-policed. What do these data points tell us about the type of policing that's happening in San Diego?
Do you want to go first, or me, or?
You can go first, Bishop Bowser, and then we can go to Tasha.
Okay, kind of police I'm seeing today is, you know, and to understand that you have to look at it from a historical lens, right? But basically one of the things that we're really tackling is being over-policed, and through that over-policing you have what we call racial profiling, you have bias policing, pretext stops that are used as a way to stop someone for equipment violation or a traffic violation, pull them over, and then continue investigation, because basically what is happening is what we call as racial profiling. And, you know, because our communities have been criminalized, you know, our culture has been criminalized from the perspective, when you talk about blacks, when you look at a young black man, you know, you either think he's a drug dealer, a gang member, or some type of criminal, a threat, or dangerous, or and things like that. So most of the time there's an implicit bias, and sometimes explicit, where police officers, you know, they have been trained to use pretext stops as a tool to, you know, prevent crime, they say, but it's really racial profiling. And through the historical lens, what has happened is that this started way back, you know, when you talk about the drug interdiction, and when you talk about, there was a gentleman in Florida, Bob Vogel, who was a Florida State trooper that created a profile, and he made a huge arrests, and he became kind of like a celebrity. The DEA picked up that, and they ended up calling it Operation Pipeline, where they trained 27,000 police officers in 48 states, right? And one of the things that they did is they trained them on how to profile people who were, you know, traveling in drugs, right? You know, whether it's by airplane, by boat, or by car. And so what ended up happening, it started on the freeways, where they were profiling these individuals based on their ethnic background, based on if the profile, if they fit, the person fits the kind of car they're driving, and of course, you know, other different things that they would look at. But so what ended up happening with that is through that, you had a pretext stop and the over-policing, and it just took it to another level with the Clinton crime bill, right? Because when you look at that, I was just talking to a high-ranking police officer that policed one of the departments in the county of San Diego, I should say. And he told me he came into force right when the crime bill had passed, Clinton crime bill had passed. He said the way they were trained is that they hired a lot of police officers through that bill, because they had the money for it, and they trained them to arrest people and put them in prison. Said their job was to fill the prisons. And so what has to happen is that culture has to change. And you come up to 2020, that culture has not changed. We still have the same thing happening today, where you have a lot of folks that are being arrested, and most of the rest are petty arrests, right? Like misdemeanors and so on. And so if we're going to build trust, if we're going to have a community to where everyone can be safe, then we most definitely have to be safe also from the police racial profiling. And the other thing I want to add to the pretext stops and racial profiling is the stalking, right? Because one of the things that many don't talk about, and from my own experience, being a black man for all my life, is that, you know, you many times you may not be pulled over by the police, but they follow you. They follow you. I've been followed many times right to my doorsteps of my house, right? And it really annoying, and it's traumatizing, and it angers you. You know, when you moment they get behind you, you know what's going to happen, right? So it's not just the pretext that, even though if we end that, we can also end a lot of the other behaviors of policing when it's biased, because they're looking at the race of the individual and they're looking at the community that they live in, and they automatically assume that if I pull this guy over, I'm gonna get a gun or I'm gonna get some drugs. And no matter how many guns you get off the street, no matter how many people you put in prison, you're still gonna have an issue with violence, you're still gonna have the issue with crime until you work with the community to deal with those issues and address the underlying issues, which one is poverty and communities being underserved and addressing the trauma. I wanna hold right there because I don't wanna take up too much of time.
I actually want to follow up on a couple of things that you mentioned, Bishop Bowles, and then we can turn to Tasha. But you mentioned pretext stops as something that the local police here do often. Do pretext stops have any public safety value? Is it effective in what they're trying to achieve?
No, it's not effective at all, right? Because one of the things when you look at the pretext stops and what they're doing is they're stopping a whole lot of people. And they're, you know, I'm just using an example, it's not exact fact, but it's an example. You can stop 100 people and get 2 guns. You really haven't made the community safe, right? And you don't know what those individuals would have done with those guns or the drugs. So what ended up happening is you harm the community and you harm the relationship, because now you have a lot of people that's constantly being pulled over. You have young Black men that are being pulled over 2 or 3 times a month, many times in that year, aside the stalking and all the other different things that are happening in their life in dealing with policing. It does not make the community safe whatsoever. It can really cause, make it more unsafe, because what ended up happening is the community do not want to call the police or deal with the police when there is crime. Things need to be reported. And it's not because they're afraid of the community or those they think are perpetrators, but it's more so the relationship and the strain that has been placed with between the Black community and police, and communities of color. You know, Latinos face the same thing.
Mm-hmm. And I know there's been like a lot of data looking at, you know, police stops and searches and if they've been effective. Can you speak to some of that data, and then also like any policies that, you know, the San Diego region can implement to address this ineffective police practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things is that when you look at the racial profile and the over policing, what ended up happening is when you compare it, right, you find that Black people are 219% at a higher rate per population stop, versus when you look at the stops that they do with white people, right? And then when you look at contraband that is found, you find contraband more so with the stops of white people than you do with Blacks. And we know that that's simply because they're over policing and stopping a lot of folks they don't need to stop in the Black community versus the white community. And when you talk about drugs, you know, and you look at cocaine, for example, 80% of cocaine users are white people, right? Even when you narrow it down to crack cocaine, about 5% of Black people use crack cocaine, and 3% of white people use crack cocaine. So when they try to talk about the drugs, see, look at all these people in prison, these Black folks and brown folks in prison. It must be a drug problem. No, because you're focusing on that community. And so that's what creates a problem right there. And what needs to happen is the talk that is happening nationally, right? What things they are suggesting is in the pretext stops, right? Other thing that they're suggesting is ban consent searches, because that creates a problem also, because if you stop an individual and say, can I search your car? This person is intimidated, afraid. They don't want to get a ticket. They want to cooperate. They want to be accused of not complying, or now you got something to hide because you don't want me to search your car. So, and many times they don't know their rights. So we should ban consent searches, right? And I know what we do in California through AB 953, which is the REPA, in many other states, when you talk about being able to track that data, since Clinton in the late 90s had ordered that data started being tracked for individuals being in traffic stops. They need some type of data on that, but we need to perfect it in California, perfect it in San Diego, from the perspective of those traffic stops that are happening and what kind of stops are happening and why those stops. We need more information on that, but I am thankful for the bill that passed. And those are some of the things I look at. And I think one of the things I'll add to this is that in California versus other states, you don't have fourth waivers, right? Most times it's your probation officer can come and search a car. Fourth waiver is when a person giving up their Fourth Amendment right, where police can come in and just search their house, their car, their purses, and things like that. That only happens, it happens in other states, but mostly in California. You look at other states, they don't do that. Not even the police can do that. And so we need to also add fourth waivers on there that you can't stop them because you know they're on probation and search their car, take them out of their car and handcuff. Because we know in 1997, a law, the Supreme Court ruled that a person could be pulled out of their car. And then I think in 1999, the court ruled that if the driver is arrested, that the officer can search the passenger's purse, even if it's closed, even if that individual, she has not committed a crime or done anything. So we have some huge problems. And so that's how we could fix it with some minor changes and change. But ultimately, you got to change the culture. You know, we could have policies, but you got to change the police culture to really change how the communities of police and start building trust in the communities.
Thank you, Bishop Bowser. And when you were mentioning policies, it reminded me of our coalition's work around Pretext, which is preventing over-policing through equitable community treatment. And this is a policy that we're hoping to see passed at the city level. I think I want to turn to Tasha now to ask you the same question. What is the type of the policing that you've been seeing in San Diego, Tasha?
Very discriminatory. I think that when you look around for policing just a day ago, a Black woman was stopped, African woman was stopped on the 67 freeway by Sheriff Deputy Lovejoy. And instead of writing her a ticket, he snatched her out of the vehicle, used excessive force, and took her to the jail where she was rejected. And then held her for 5 hours. These are things that are continually happening across the county of San Diego, where people of color, especially Black women and men and children, are being stopped for low-level offenses, traffic offenses that are escalating. In an era where all of the Chiefs Association is talking about de-escalation and using that as a tool to bridge the divide between community and police, but yet we still have instances of escalation. Also, piggybacking on what Bishop Bowser said, is that the use of force is much higher for Black people than it is for white people. And that use of force is not just injury, but is also when they use their weapons. Many times we've seen across the nation, and including here in San Diego, where traffic stops have led to serious violence at the hands of police and also death. And so again, the culture has to shift. Chiefs and sheriffs have to hold their officers accountable. There must be more training. We must find ways to de-escalate at scenes. Officers must follow their policies and procedures and the law. And these things must happen, and they must happen swiftly. The accountability for not doing so must be felt across the departments so that other officers will not do it. Until then, officers are going to be rogue, reckless, and lawless, and there's a lack of accountability. They have all the data that they need for themselves to change their culture. It is about the leadership and the government to make sure that these officers are held accountable, and their chiefs and sheriffs alike.
Thank you, Tasha. I was wondering if you could share, since you do extensive work with people who have been over-policed or had bad experiences with the police, can you share a little bit about what the impact has been on people's lives who have been, continuously pulled over, or, who have had bad interactions with the police? Like, what impact has that had on their lives?
Many of these folks are afraid to come forward out of fear of retaliation. Oftentimes, they are terrorized and live with trauma that they don't necessarily know how to deal with, or are exposed to, excuse me, elements that can help them recover from that trauma. So it's very difficult. We, as Black people and people of color, are terrorized oftentimes by police with the saturation of police in our communities. Many communities that are saturated with police do not have the highest rate of crime. Oftentimes, it is the criminalization in those neighborhoods that happens that has led to mass incarceration, and the reason why so many activists and organizers and leaders are pushing legislation to try and curb what has happened to groups of people. And oftentimes we're finding that chiefs and sheriffs are fighting against new legislation that has been passed to not following and abiding by them. And there is no recourse for this when it happens. And so we have to also hold them accountable to the legislation that we pass as a people and that the government passes as well.
Thank you. I appreciate you mentioning about how communities have been criminalized for things in other communities where they're not being policed for or criminalized for. And that's part of our coalition's work at CPAT is about decriminalizing low-level offenses, because a lot of these offenses don't merit a law enforcement response, like somebody dealing with mental health and even homelessness, which actually turns me to Michele Woodson. I wanted to bring you in the conversation. You work extensively with clients that experience homelessness, and many of them have frequent encounters with the police. What can you share about the type of policing that's happening in San Diego with your clients?
Thank you, Chelsea. That's a really great question. I want to start off by noting that San Diego is the 4th largest homeless population in the nation. And we've been ranked the 4th largest for over a decade now. And what we're seeing when we talk about the issue of homelessness, it's really the end result of systematic failures. So the same populations that are represented in our homeless population are the same populations that have historically been marginalized. I want to make a point to note that the Black population is 6.5% of San Diego's population, but account for over 19% of our homeless population. So that disproportionate statistics really shows that we're continuing to marginalize the same populations in this way. And in San Diego specifically, we are seeing a lot of homeless individuals being criminalized for engaging in life-sustaining activities. These are low-level, non-violent offenses that have to do with eating, sleeping, standing, right? These are all things that homeless individuals have to do. These are things that folks like you and me have to do. We have to sleep, we have to rest, we have to sit, right? We have to eat. And when you're homeless, you don't have a lot of options on where you can do that in private. There is actually presiding case law. It was a 9th Circuit decision, Maine versus Boise, that found that it was unconstitutional to criminalize folks for sleeping on the street when there's literally no other option. The court found that it was a violation of the 8th Amendment, that it was considered cruel and unusual punishment to do so, to criminalize folks for sleeping on the street when there's literally no other option for them. And that's what we're doing here in San Diego. We criminalize people for sleeping on the street. We criminalize them for being on the sidewalk. And so a lot of organizations, including Think Dignity, have challenged the constitutionality of these local municipal ordinances, right? Because what we're seeing is that if you continue to criminalize people for these life-sustaining behaviors, you continue to perpetuate poverty, because now they're left with a criminal record. And what does a criminal record do? It further entrenches you into poverty and into homelessness. With a criminal record, a lot of my clients I found, so I actually practice in criminal defense, and most of my work has been in post-conviction relief, right? So after somebody has been convicted of a crime, how do we alleviate some of those legal barriers so that they can readily access the resources they need to become self-sustaining, right? Self-sufficient. And so folks with criminal records are left with barriers for accessing employment, county benefits, educational opportunities, right? And they're left with these excessive fees and fines that will take a lifetime for them to pay off. If I can give an example, one of my very first clients that I represented while I was working at since I've been working at Think Dignity, was a young mom who was homeless and continued to be criminalized for sleeping on the street. It was a violation of a municipal code that made it illegal it was actually an encroachment ticket, right? So initially this municipal code was created to prevent businesses from putting things out on the sidewalk. So much of what we see now, right, during the pandemic is that we're outside eating. And so what happened is we saw there was actually a settlement, right, that the city had to stop ticketing folks for illegal lodging. Once that settlement hit, we saw a huge increase in the amount of people that were being cited for encroachment. This encroachment municipal code was meant to protect the businesses, right? To protect the city, so that if somebody tripped on one of these things that was on the sidewalk, they would have to go after the business owner and not the city. But we're seeing that this municipal code is being used against people, specifically homeless individuals, right? I had a client who had multiple tickets for this, and this is not just a ticket that you need to pay off. This was actually considered a misdemeanor. So she had multiple cases of misdemeanor, and she was on probation. Each probation was 3 years of probation. What the city was doing, they were also implementing stay away orders as a condition of her probation. So she was required to stay away from certain vicinities, mostly in downtown San Diego, right? East Village, because that's where most folks experiencing homelessness stay. And why is that? Because it's a hub of the resource serving agencies. That's where all of the homeless serving providing agencies are located. So it's easy to access services there. As a condition of her probation, she was actually ordered to stay away from this area because that's where she was found sleeping. She was 8 months pregnant at the time that she was incarcerated for this. So when I became her attorney and I represented her, I was challenging this, right? Because she actually got into housing in one of the shelters in downtown, but could not legally access it because of the stay away orders that were in place because of her probation. So we had to go into court and challenge that to say that the way that you're criminalizing this young woman is literally perpetuating her poverty. She got into housing, but literally couldn't do it because of her probation. And so we were able to lift that condition of her probation and get her off of some of the other probations that she was on, because these stack up. So if you get a ticket for encroachment one time, you get a misdemeanor and you are on probation for 3 years. If you get another one, that's a subsequent 3 years. Those don't combine. So she was on probation for 4 of these, for 3-year increments. And that's what we're seeing here in San Diego. It's really counterintuitive if you think about it, right? Is that we're not rather than providing folks the access to the resources that they obviously need if they have nowhere to sleep, nowhere to eat, nowhere to stand, we're continuing to criminalize them and further entrenching them into the poverty we say that we want them to get out of.
Thank you for that story, Michele. And I think it, clearly demonstrates how police are not good first responders to people experiencing homelessness, even mental health. And we've seen cities recently look at alternatives to policing. So Eugene establishing the Cahoots program that's been in existence for like over 20 years. That sends a community health paramedic and a community health paramedic and a mental health specialist to people experiencing mental health calls. And then also Berkeley, even like looking at removing police from traffic enforcement and stuff like that. And I just want to highlight, Voice of San Diego, did reporting on the sedition ticketing that SEPD was doing. And in response, the city decriminalized that law that was actually like unconstitutional, right? So this is, other things that we can do where like we shouldn't be sending law enforcement, where we can decriminalize, surviving and sleeping in public, that like, doesn't give people the resources that you need. So I want to turn the conversation to money because that is, related to policy. So we've gotten a sense of what policing looks like in San Diego. Let's turn to Dr. Green. Your organization, CPI, studies city budgets closely. What can you share with us about how much money we invest in policing? And I'll share screen on the graphics that you wanted to share today. Give me 1 second.
Thank you so much for that, Chelsea. So In terms of, as you're going to this, I think the thing to keep in mind is that as we're talking about the money that goes to policing, I'm going to talk about a couple of examples in our city and our county. But just to be clear, there's policing happening in every institution we can think of, including our schools, including the kind of security work that's happening in hospitals that creates that as a space that's policed as well. So these are just some examples of how we spend our funds. And at the work we do at CPI, along with a variety of community partners, we could not do it without a broad coalition of people. We argue that a budget is a moral document. It tells you about the values and priorities of a community. And so when we look at something like the City of San Diego budget, some things to point out about this graph is that it identifies that when we look at the budget that was adopted for this year, over $500 million, or 35% of all general fund expenditures, went to the police department. And if you're looking at this graph, and if you can't see it, I want to just describe it to you. This is a bar that's twice as tall almost as any other bar located for the other types of core services provided by the city. Things like fire and rescue services, library services, stormwater services, providing for our protection of our property and our safety. So there's really this focus on the idea that this significant amount of the money that we have that's not dedicated to other purposes is going into policing. And on the side is just pointing out that when we got CARES Act money that was designated to help us deal with the crisis of COVID, almost a third of those funds, over $42 million, went just to policing for payroll, staffing, and supplies. That's not even counting the kind of money that we see every single year going into police overtime. That's mostly not accounted for when we adopt the budget, but is a way that police expenditures increase. And we see year-over-year increases in the police budget, regardless of what the crime rate looks like in a region or place. We see things like this almost $35 million increase in the budget from last fiscal year to this year that we're adopting. When we look at the county and look at the sheriff's department, I think one of the other things to note, if we could, is that when we use the term policing, I think we all agree about this as panelists, we are often talking about police or sheriffs, but we're actually talking about the whole system of policing, from the patrols that happen on the street as policing, to prosecution, to probation and incarceration. And you see how this captures just amazing amounts of money in our budget. So the department that's dedicated, the agency where Sheriff's Department is located, is called Public Safety. And we can talk about why that might be a bit of a misnomer from the perspective of many of us when we think about these expenditures. But 59%, almost 60% of general purpose revenue, again, that's the money we take in from taxpayers that we could use for any purpose that we want to. It's not allocated to anything else. Almost 60% of that general purpose revenue in this currently adopted budget goes to the Public Safety Department. But over half of that money goes to just the Sheriff's Department. If you add the Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney for prosecution, that represents 68% of all of our general purpose revenue. So it's not hard to understand how policing takes up sums of money that could easily be used to actually address the kinds of issues that Michelli and Bishop Bowser, Chelsea, Tasha, that you've pointed out are the actual solutions to the things that make us unsafe, individually and collectively. But instead, we're spending it here in a source of funding that we're allocating it to something that often, as Bishop Bowser pointed out, doesn't just not make us safe, but actually makes us unsafe.
Thank you for that overview of the budget. I know it's super helpful to have these numbers to understand not just what policing looks like, in the streets, but also how much money our government is investing in this resource that isn't effective in addressing the things that are afflicting people and communities. So I'm going to stop sharing screen. So now I want to turn to all of our panelists. Related to police budgets, one calling cry that has been echoed in multiple cities across the nation, including here in San Diego, is defund the police. What does defund the police mean, and what is the rationale and origins of this demand? I think I'll just, point to people so that there's not an awkward moment, but we'll go to Dr. Green, and then we'll see who wants to answer next.
Absolutely. So I think the important thing about the term defund is that it means different things to different people. It ranges from folks who want to reallocate at least some portion of the money that's currently spent on policing and prosecution and incarceration to reallocate that money to other non-police interventions and programs that create public safety. But it also includes people who believe all the way to some form of police abolition, that we can police ourselves as communities and we don't need these types of institutions. I think what's important to understand about that conversation, in addition, is that there's this very specific moment of history about what's happened in terms of funding police. Michelle Alexander talks about this in her book, The New Jim Crow, that we have to understand that as we desegregated so many institutions by law, the institutions of policing have become the place that we spend money to recreate those racial boundaries. And we have spent that money on a war. We literally call it a war on crime, a war on drugs, but what it has been a war on is the freedom of movement and peace for people in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities in reality. And you can see that across the nation. So folks who are talking about defunding police are talking about better solutions to actual community problems, but addressing that one of those community problems is race and racism and the use of these structures to maintain a system of white supremacy.
Would any of our other panelists like to, chime in on what defund the police means, and more background on this calling cry?
Yeah, I think that I would like to just echo a lot of what Dr. Green has mentioned, right? So if we think about the historical context of policing, it has racist origins, right? And so we're continuing to see, as she mentioned, the same communities continue to be marginalized through the system of policing. We've invested so much money nationally, but specifically here in San Diego, to these police budgets, to this idea that increased policing increases safety, right? And we need to start challenging those notions. If what we're seeing here, and we've heard from all the panelists today speak to how this did not make their community safer, and in fact, it only perpetuates poverty, racism, bigotry, right? It perpetuates all these things that we're trying to get away from. So what we're saying is, when we say to defund the police, to reallocate that funding, all of that money, those millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that we're utilizing to fund our police departments and our sheriff's departments, to reallocate that to what the city actually needs, right? What our county actually needs. And so let's shift the funding to these social services that can improve these things. So many of the things that we mentioned today, right? Mental health, addiction, homelessness. We see that these issues are not being adequately funded and not given the proper attention, right? And so that's what we're calling for when we say to defund the police, is to defund the police and reinvest into the communities and into our people, so that we can continue to decriminalize these issues and also destigmatize mental illness, homelessness, addiction, right? And we can really get the community the assistance that they need so that they can become self-sufficient, right? And isn't that what we're all looking for? We're looking for a community in which people have access to the resources they need so that they can be contributing members of society. So it behooves all of us to continue to advocate for these, to fund all of these different programs that help to empower the community with ways to move their lives in a more positive path forward.
Exactly. Thank you. And honestly, looking at the charts that Dr. Green shared with us, the money's there. It's in the public safety budget. It's in the police budget, because we saw how bloated those budgets were compared to other departments. I want to bring in Tasha and Dr. Green to give perspective on how Defund the Police has change the local conversation. You know, both of y'all are folks that have worked in the San Diego community for a while now, so you can give that perspective on like what the local conversation has been around addressing police. So I'm curious how Defund the Police has shifted this conversation.
Yeah, most definitely. I think that one thing that we have to understand is that there's definitely a divide across San Diego on merely understanding what people are saying when they say defund the police, and then other folks who are very pro-police.
I think
law enforcement have been you know, involved in. You know, we look across the state of California, there's over 17 gangs that are led by not just sheriff deputies, but also local law enforcement across California. These are criminal enterprises that work within law enforcement departments, have misused and abused funding that is provided to those law enforcement departments, and there must be accountability.
Oh, it looks like we lost Tasha. Maybe we'll be able to bring her back in, but we can turn to Dr. Green.
Yes, I would say that, oh, Tasha's back. I'll see if she gets back in here. But just to say that the main, sorry, Tasha, are you there?
Yes,
Hey,
I'm
Tasha,
sorry, it's connected. Go ahead.
No, do you wanna finish your thought and then we can turn to Dr. Green?
Yeah. Sure, I'm sorry about that. It reconnected for some reason. But across the nation, these departments have been misusing and abusing funding that has been provided. That is our tax dollars. They are merely criminal enterprises that are using public dollars. That money can be reallocated. There are things like, if you look at the Compton police report, if you look at you know, Los Angeles and how the feds took them over. You look at the
It looks like we lost Tasha again. We could turn to Dr. Green for now before we go to Q&A soon.
I'll just say that I think that the use of the phrase defund the police has been one of the most important contributions of this movement in this moment, because many people say you don't need that kind of language, it just stirs people up. But what I say to lots of folks is, this is a conversation we've been having. And if you were not paying attention and what it took was those words, defund the police, to get your attention, then it's done what it needs to do, because this is clearly an important conversation for us to have. I think we've seen activism around, you know, police accountability in general, but I think particularly this conversation, as someone who's been part of a vibrant community of people doing budget work, but still not big enough, not enough of us. This is a phrase that's brought people to looking at budgets and wanting to understand something that on the surface, I'll admit, doesn't seem that exciting and doesn't seem as important. And having a conversation about funding and defunding and where our money goes has activated a group of people to participate in a public decision-making process that they were always entitled to be a part of. It's invited them in, and so I think it's powerful and to be respected and commended.
Thank you. Yeah, I know I heard a lot of buzz from that 11-hour city council session when we were reviewing the budget. So definitely a testament to the increased engagement around, you know, reviewing the budget. Before we go to Q&A, I just want to ask, turn to Bishop Bowser. You know, so far, you know, at the beginning of this conversation, we talked about like policies to address the role and scope and budget of police, right? And we're all part of the Coalition for Police Accountability and Transparency. And so, Bishop Bowser, what is one of the policies that you could share today that, you know, addresses this question of reducing the activity of police in our communities?
Yes, one of the policy changes we actually is called Protect. It's a city ordinance that we want to get passed through the city council and with the county. But Protect stands for Preventing Over-Policing Through Equitable Community Treatment. Just to give you a few points of what this ordinance would do, it would require officers to have probable cause to stop, or detain anyone. And this includes, as I mentioned earlier, fourth waivers. That's people on probation or parole who have waived some of their Fourth Amendment rights. It also requires a probable cause for searches. Instead of asking for consent search, you need a probable cause. It prohibits officers from questioning people about any offense beyond the offense of which they were stopped, unless the officer have probable cause to do so. And we know that the state of Oregon just issued a order from the perspective that if a police officer stops someone for a quick equipment violation, you can't start questioning me about other things. Deal with that, give me a ticket, let me go. And that's all we're asking. And it also, what this ordinance will also do is hold officers accountable if they violate the city ordinance. And so, because you have to have some kind of way to change that behavior. We believe that Protect will integrate itself into the police department to help change the culture within the policing, which in turn changes how they police our community. As we talk about defunding, we want at the least amount of contact that we can have with police until they learn and are trained and are adopting better police practices in how they treat community members based on the procedural justice practices that the Obama administration on 21st century policing did release. And so that's it in a nutshell, you know, when you talk about Protect and one of the ordinances or policies we're trying to get through.
Thank you. And if folks are curious about, you know, what other policies CPAT is working on, you can definitely follow us on our social media. We have a Police Accountability Now package, which touches on Protect, which touches on decriminalizing low-level offenses, which touches on divesting from police and investing in non-law enforcement alternatives. So if you're curious for more details, follow us on social media. So with that, then we'll turn to Q&A. Let's see. I'm looking at the Q&A box. It looks like we've already got some answers, but looking at the open one. So there's a question about the Crisis Act. And if folks can share what it was like to support the Crisis Act, and how did you feel about it being vetoed by the governor? Any of our panelists feel comfortable answering that question? I can also supplement some info too. Okay, so I can fill in some information. So the Crisis Act was one of the ACLU's priority bills. This is a statewide bill. This bill, which essentially would have created a pilot program to give grants to local communities to have alternatives to police. So, you know, for communities to set up alternatives to police that would respond to people experiencing homelessness, people experiencing mental health issues. And so the Crisis Act survived and made it through the House and the Senate and made it to the governor's desk. And recently, this week, in fact, the governor vetoed the bill. So unfortunately, that failed. And I know that there was a lot of, especially like local San Diego support for this act, and it was pretty disappointing to see the governor veto it. So that's what, does anyone else have to share about the Crisis Act before we go to the next question? Okay. One question that we have here is, they said, thank you for making a compelling case for reform. Are there any templates or cheat sheets that we can use in local communities to bring in those who don't see the problem firsthand? Many people would like to help, but just won't put in the time to really understand the issue fully. Yeah, so we have these, well, actually, I'll turn to some of our CPAT partners and talk about some of the resources that we've developed with the Police Accountability Now package. But any takers? Okay, I can share some information then. So the coalition has developed fact sheets. So around the things that we mentioned with Protect, decriminalization, even community review boards, a checklist for use of force and de-escalation policies. So if you follow us on social media, you'll be able to access those resources that you can then bring to your communities and have those conversations around, what to do about policing issues in your area. One question that we have here is, does San Diego have a no-knock ordinance? I don't know the answer to this question. Do any of our panelists feel comfortable answering this one? No-knock ordinances?
Well, I think that the question that they're asking is if we utilize no-knock warrant searches here in San Diego. It's not an ordinance, it's just a different kind of warrant that's issued by a judge that gives police permission to enter a property with force prior to having to notify the occupants and requesting for their permission to enter. And so, yes, the police can utilize a no-knock warrant here in San Diego.
And I think that question might have been related to the story of Breonna Taylor and her murder by the Kentucky police because they were serving a no-knock warrant and in that process killed her.
Chelsea, Could I just go back to the previous question about people not having time to fully put into this work and looking for cheat sheets? Of course, the coalition has created these sheets and one-pagers that help people understand things. But the other thing I think that people can do, aside from getting involved in this coalition, which I think everyone should, is also that every single ballot, that feels like every year when it's time to vote, and this year is no exception, there are key issues around police accountability and what we think is acceptable and what we don't. And I think if people can just at least take the time to inform themselves about those issues, I think this forum, PolitiFest has offered some opportunities to talk about those things and offer different perspectives. I think if people can really dig in, I think all too often, folks have been assuming that if something is supported by law enforcement agencies, it's somehow inherently good and ought to get a vote, instead of taking a look at the impacts on communities. And those ballot statements often do actually have the voice of activists on the other side of it making a case. And yet we feel like people often don't even look that far into it to make sure that they're doing the things that reduce policing and give us more access to the things that support us. So I think voting is just that reminder too.
Awesome. So we have 1 minute left. I just want to wrap up. So that completes our Q&A session. Thank you all for submitting great questions. Michelle Lee, Bishop Bowser, Dr. Green, thank you for the information that you shared with us today and for the work that you continue to do in community to address bias policing and police violence. I feel honored to do this work with you. To our attendees, thank you for participating in today's community conversation. If you want to stay up to date on CPAT's work, follow us on social media at CPAT San Diego, where you can keep up to date with our work. I'll also drop my email because I see some other questions that didn't get addressed, so you can reach out to me. And that completes our panel. Goodbye, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your virtual PolitiFest experience.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. Take care. Bye-bye.